Imagine living in a world where your very first breath could be your last simply because you were born a girl. We tend to romanticize the ancient world, the marble statues, the philosophy, the empires, but for half the population, history wasn't an epic adventure, it was a survival horror. Hey everyone, welcome back. So usually when we talk about ancient history, we talk about the conquerors. We talk about Caesar crossing the Rubicon or Alexander the Great mapping the known world. We see the glory. But today, we are going to turn off the spotlight on the emperors and light a candle in the dark corners of the ancient household. We need to talk about women. And I'm not talking about the Cleopatras or the rare exceptions who clawed their way to power. I'm talking about the average woman living in Athens, Rome, Babylon, or Jerusalem. When you actually dig into the legal codes, the medical texts, and the personal letters of antiquity, you realize that the system wasn't just unfair to women, it was actively designed to control, silence, and, if necessary, destroy them. We're going to look at the terrifying reality of what it meant to be female in the ancient world. Warning, this is going to get dark. We're talking about a time when a woman's life was often measured in her value as property, and where stepping out of line could literally cost you your head.
The dangerous arrival. Let's start at the very beginning, birth. In the modern world, the birth of a child is usually a celebration, but in places like ancient Rome or Greece, the birth of a girl was often met with a heavy, dangerous silence. There is a chilling letter that dates back to 1 BC, discovered in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, written by a Greek man named Hilarion to his pregnant wife, Alice. And he writes, very casually by the way, "If you give birth to a child, if it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, expose it." Expose it. That is the sanitized historical term for abandonment. But let's call it what it really was, infanticide. In ancient Rome, the father held the patria potestas, absolute power. When a baby was born, the midwife would place the infant at the father's feet. If he picked the baby up, it was accepted into the family. If he turned away, that child was gone. And statistics show that fathers turned away from daughters at a horrifyingly higher rate than sons. These baby girls weren't just killed quickly. They were often taken to designated exposure walls or trash heaps outside the city limits and left there, left to the cold, to hunger, or to wild animals. Now, pause for a second. I want you to try and put yourself in the mindset of the mother. You have just gone through the agony of labor in a world without modern medicine, which was already a death-defying act. You are holding this newborn, and then, because of a social code that viewed daughters as financial liabilities, dowries were expensive, after all, you are forced to hand that child over to be thrown away, like broken pottery. And it wasn't just the fathers doing the dirty work. In many societies, the mothers were legally compelled to do it themselves. If a woman tried to save a rejected infant, she could be punished for disobeying the head of the household. It creates this psychological horror show where women were forced to be complicit in the destruction of their own children just to ensure their own survival in the family unit.
The silence and the stigma. If you survived childhood, you might think you were safe. You weren't. You were just entering a new phase of captivity. In ancient Athens and Rome, women were essentially viewed as perpetual children who needed to be contained. In many households, women were effectively under house arrest. A respectable woman wasn't allowed to leave her front door without a male chaperone. Even inside her own home, she was often segregated. When guests came over, she couldn't join the conversation or sit at the dinner table. She had to retreat to her quarters, hidden out of sight. Why? Because the prevailing belief was that the mere presence of a woman would disturb the focus of men. You weren't a person, you were a distraction. And if you didn't accept this silence, if you were considered stubborn or you dared to argue or show anger, The punishments were designed to humiliatingly crush your spirit. In Denmark, women who were seen as shrews, basically anyone who spoke her mind, could be locked into a shrew's fiddle. It was this wooden yoke shaped like a violin that locked around your neck and wrists. You would then be paraded through the streets so everyone could mock you for the crime of being angry in public. But the English took it to a sadistic level. They used the scold's bridle. Picture a heavy iron mask or cage that is locked onto your head. Inside, it had a metal plate, sometimes with sharp spikes that went into your mouth to hold your tongue down. And the worst part, it had a bell attached to the top. The bell was there to attract attention, signaling the whole town to come out, point, and laugh at the woman who tried to speak. The message was clear: your voice is dangerous. But according to ancient men, your biology was even worse. This brings us to the terrifying global superstitions surrounding menstruation. In the Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder, who was basically the Bill Nye of the ancient world, wrote that a woman in her period was essentially a biological weapon. He claimed that if she walked near milk, it would instantly go sour. He believed that her gaze was so toxic that if she looked at a swarm of bees, they would just drop dead out of the sky. This fear wasn't unique to Rome. It was a global panic. In ancient Egypt, women were forced into special isolation huts during their cycle because men were terrified to be near them. In Jewish tradition, the laws of Nida meant a woman was ritually impure. A man couldn't touch her or even touch an object she had sat on without becoming unclean himself. But if you go to the Pacific, the stakes were literally life and death. In ancient Hawaii, if a man dared to step into the menstrual hut where women were secluded, he faced the death penalty. And the indigenous tribes of Papua New Guinea took this fear to the absolute extreme. They believed that if a man touched a menstruating woman, his blood would turn black, his mind would rot, and he would die a slow, agonizing death. So imagine growing up with that narrative. You are told your voice needs a cage, your presence is a distraction, and your natural biology is a lethal poison. It was a systematic way of making women feel small, dangerous, and ashamed of their own existence.
So, you've survived childhood, and you've learned to be silent. Now comes the most dangerous transition of all, marriage. But marriage is too romantic a word for what often happened. Let's talk about bride kidnapping. In the earliest days of Rome, and in many ancient Germanic and steppe cultures, you didn't court a girl, you stole her. We actually still see echoes of this today in the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold. It symbolizes the fact that she didn't walk in willingly. Historically, this was often a violent abduction. A man would see a woman he wanted, or a woman whose family had resources he wanted, and he would take her. If he managed to keep her, the law often eventually recognized them as married. It was might makes right applied to intimacy. And why was the woman herself so valuable? It wasn't her personality, it was her purity. Virginity in the ancient world was a form of currency. It was the seal of authenticity on a woman. And if that seal was broken, the consequences were lethal. But it wasn't just priestesses. In ancient Israelite law and other Near Eastern codes, a bride who was found not to be a virgin on her wedding night could be stoned to death at the door of her father's house. In ancient Greece, a father had absolute authority. If he discovered his unmarried daughter had slept with someone, he didn't just ground her. He had the legal right to drag her to the market and sell her into slavery. She was considered damaged goods. And this obsession with proof could get incredibly invasive. In traditional Samoan culture, the village chief would perform a public ritual during the wedding. He would manually break the bride's hymen with his finger in front of the gathered witnesses to prove her purity. It was a public spectacle of ownership. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were priestesses who kept the sacred fire of the city burning. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, she wasn't just fired, she was carried through the city in a funeral procession while she was still alive and taken to an underground chamber. They would leave her with a loaf of bread and a lamp and then seal the entrance. She was buried alive. Now, because a woman's value was entirely tied to this purity,
rape wasn't viewed as a violation of human rights. It was viewed as property damage. In Roman law, if a man raped a slave girl, he hadn't committed a crime against her, he had committed a crime against her master. It was the same legal equivalent as vandalizing someone's wagon. The rapist didn't apologize to the woman, he paid a fine to the owner to cover the depreciation of his property. If you were a slave, sexual access was considered part of the job description. A slave had no legal standing to say no. But this exemption extended to free women too. If you worked as a barmaid, a waitress, or an actress, the Roman courts ruled that you were lower class, and therefore you were always available.
The double standard of adultery. Let's look at how adultery was punished, because nothing highlights the inequality of the past quite like cheating. For a man in the ancient world, sleeping around was practically a hobby. As long as you didn't steal another man's wife, nobody blinked an eye. But for a woman, adultery wasn't just a scandal, it was the end of her life. In ancient Rome, a husband had the legal right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. If he walked into his bedroom and caught his wife with another man, he was legally permitted to kill her on the spot. No trial, no questions asked. Even centuries later, the Puritans, despite being incredibly pious, were ready to hand down death sentences for women who strayed. Medieval society didn't just want an unfaithful woman dead. They wanted her to suffer in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend. They invented a torture device specifically for this purpose, known as the breast ripper. It was a cold, iron instrument with sharp, claw-like prongs. The torturer would heat the device until it was glowing red hot. They would then fasten it onto the woman's exposed chest and pull. The claws would tear the breast tissue apart from the body. The pain was designed to be unbearable, leaving the woman disfigured or dead from shock and blood loss. But here's the detail that turns this from cruel to absolutely monstrous. The breast ripper wasn't just reserved for adulterers. It was also used on women who suffered miscarriages. In the twisted logic of the time, if a woman lost a baby, she was often suspected of inducing an abortion or being a witch who had cursed the child. So imagine the horror. You are a woman who has just gone through the physical and emotional trauma of losing a baby, you're grieving, and instead of comfort, the town accuses you of murder and drags you to the torture chamber to face the red-hot claws. It wasn't about justice, it was about terror. It was a brutal way of controlling the female body and ensuring that a woman's reproductive capacity was owned entirely by men, to the point where even a medical tragedy was treated as a capital crime. The duty to die. In many ancient cultures, your existence was so tied to your husband that if he ceased to exist, you were expected to expire too. This brings us to the practice known as sati in India. Now, while we often think of this as ancient history, this practice actually persisted well into the 19th century. The concept was terrifyingly simple. A good wife was one who followed her husband into the afterlife, literally. When a man died and was placed on the funeral pyre to be cremated, his widow was expected and often socially coerced to climb onto that burning stock of wood and burn alive beside his corpse. Her life had no meaning without her owner. But there is a specific variation of this that is even more gut-wrenching. It happened during times of war. It was called Jauhar. Imagine a city under siege. The enemy is at the gates and defeat looks inevitable. In a modern context, you would try to evacuate the civilians. But in this specific historical context, the women were told to do the unthinkable. Rather than risk being captured or enslaved by the enemy, the women of the village would commit mass self-immolation. They would gather their children, walk into a massive fire, and burn themselves to death. The women weren't just dying to escape capture, they were dying to give their husbands motivation. They were reduced to literal human fuel for male honor. It is the ultimate example of a world where a woman's life was considered completely disposable,
useful only to serve the emotional or spiritual needs of a man, even in the most agonizing death imaginable.
When you step back and look at the full picture, from the baby girl left on a trash heap to the widow stepping onto a funeral pyre, a terrifying pattern emerges. The ancient world wasn't just hard for women. It was a machine designed to erase them. We see a system where a woman's life was a constant navigation of lethal minefields. She had to survive the silence of her childhood, the commodification of her marriage, and laws that viewed her body as property to be damaged, not a person to be protected. She was expected to be invisible in life and disposable in death. It is easy to look back at these women as tragic victims, and they were, but I think they deserve to be seen as something more. Think about the sheer strength it took to exist in a world that wanted you small, to raise children in a society that might force you to abandon them, to find moments of joy, love, or rebellion in a life script written entirely by men. The fact that they survived, that they endured these horrors to keep humanity going, is perhaps the greatest unsung victory in history. They were not just footnotes in the stories of great men. They were the survivors of a silent, centuries-long war. And remembering their reality is the least we can do to give them the voice they were denied for so long. If this deep dive into the darker side of history opened your eyes, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel get these stories out to more people. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these ancient laws shocked you the most? Let's talk about it down below. If you want to keep exploring the untold and, frankly, the terrifying parts of our past, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. We have a lot more history to uncover. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.